So I am back today with Professor Beatrice Yorker, who I have spoken with previously and who I'm so excited to have with me again today. Professor Yorker served as the Dean of Health and Human Services at California State University in Los Angeles from 2005 to 2015. She is currently a Professor Emerita of Nursing and Criminal Justice and Criminalistics, and I will add, among many other things, I know that you run Munchausen syndrome support groups, and I refer to you as a voice for many people who don't have one. Thank you very much for what you do, B, and thank you for being with me again today. And we're going to talk about something that I've been very excited to talk to you about, and I can't think of anyone better to talk about this subject with, and that is serial killers in the field of healthcare, in particular two that are quite famous that you know about be in Canada, and that is Elizabeth Wettlaufer, if I have that right, and Dr. Brian Nadler, who has recently been, I don't know that that's been proven, but there's allegations of him participating in this. So can we talk a little bit about who these two people are?
Yes, and I am much more familiar with Elizabeth Wettlaufer because the Canadian government hired me to update our 2006 publication on healthcare serial killers, serial murder in healthcare, because we've gathered a lot more data since our 2006 article that was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. So the Canadian government provided me with all of the documents they had. So that included the coroner's report, the depositions during the long-term care public inquiry. When Elizabeth confessed to injecting 9 or 10 patients with insulin, and most of them died, and she had done this over 10 years, the public was so outraged that she had not been stopped. And they felt that it warranted a public inquiry to look at the grassroots causes, and it was multiple causes, into how this could have happened and how she was not stopped. And in fact, she would not have been stopped had she not turned herself in. So, writing that report and having access to all of the documents that the government has now made public as part of the long-term care inquiry, I'm just so much more familiar. All I have seen is a couple of news reports on Brian Nadler.
Okay.
And you may update me on that and I can comment.
Yeah, I actually don't have too many updates on him, other than I know that he was an Ontario doctor, and I believe that there were significant red flags that people tried to bring forward that were either dismissed or they were retaliated against for doing so, and a similar type of thing. But he, I believe, so he directly murdered a number of elderly patients, allegedly. He has not, from what I understand, gone to trial yet. But it was a similar situation. I don't recall how he was actually caught, to be honest with you, but you did answer my question about Wettlaufer, because my question is how these people are finally caught. And so it was her turning herself in.
And she is the only one of 152 healthcare serial killers currently in our database who turned herself in. Some of them confessed after they were caught, but it was kind of a not real confession. Some of them would say, I only did it to help the patients. Some will say I was putting them out of their misery. Some will say the patients were going to die anyway. This just hastened their death. So they were kind of using a euthanasia justification, but that is bull. Right. Because when we went and looked at the medical records of the patients who suspiciously died under the care of a healthcare serial killer who was being investigated, Some of those patients were in for a biopsy. Some of those patients were going to be discharged. And many of them were not terminal. The other reason that euthanasia is kind of a bull justification, or, why they can, in their ultimate confession, they said, I was only doing euthanasia, is because authentic euthanasia, you get informed consent from the patient, from the family. Everybody writes down, I request to have euthanasia. I request that my life be ended through medical means. And none of the patients who suspiciously died at the hands of somebody who's prosecuted for murder of their patients, none of those patients or their families had consented or agreed to having their family member euthanized.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I know, B, that you have a copy, and feel free to pull it up as you see fit here. You have a copy of Wetlaufer's confession. So I guess this is sort of a two-part question. Was that confession even believed? And what types of personalities are we dealing with these types of folks?
So it's a fascinating story. And I can only imagine what the staff of the mental health center thought when she showed up. She said, I need to be admitted to the inpatient unit because I am having a lot of depression. I'm kind of feeling suicidal, and I am stealing patients' OxyContin from work. I'm using substances again, so I need rehab. And I'm also probably a danger to others because I have been injecting patients with insulin and causing them to die. So I'm sure that the staff just went, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So she was immediately placed on an involuntary hold because she did qualify as a danger to herself and to others. And she was notified of her rights. And they told her, you need to understand that what you're telling us is very likely criminal behavior. And so we will have to call the authorities. And she said, I understand. And then they tried to stabilize her and detox her, and she was admitted for a while. And during that period of time, she took the time to write down her confession. So I'm just going to go ahead and, so her confession was believed. Oh, believe
Okay.
me.
Oh, okay. All right.
It was definitely believed.
Okay.
So let me share here. This is the discharge summary. So if I can just show everybody, this is accessible. It's public domain. It is part of the inquiry. It's Appendix D. And this is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. This is the discharge summary. After she had been stabilized, I believe she was there a couple of weeks, but it says right here, her admission date. It's in here somewhere. She was discharged on the 10th of May, 2016. And she was discharged with these diagnoses: major depressive disorder, recurrent episode during her that you had to have been fire setting, cruelty to animals, things like that when you were a child. But she didn't really have that. And then binge eating disorder. Okay. So that's just the summary. Let me now go to her confession. And again, this is Appendix A to the statement of facts in the public inquiry. And she wrote this on September 24th. Is that right? Written, yeah, September 24th. So she went back to September 2007. She was working at Carescent Care. And James Silcox was not diabetic, but he had dementia. She was also working a double shift, 3 to 7. James was known for inappropriately touching the staff. He was not diabetic. That evening, I got the urge to overdose James. I was angry that he was so inappropriate. At approximately 9:30 p.m., I decided to overdose him with insulin, hoping he would die. I felt it was his time to go because of the way he acted. I remember feeling angry at him. I think he was grabbing breasts of the nurses, and that had come across in the report, and she may have had an unpleasant encounter with him. And then she goes, I went into the med room and used a spare insulin needle to prepare a dose of 50 units of short-acting insulin. I gave it to him at approximately 10:30 p.m. Throughout the night, after I overdosed him, James called out, I'm sorry, and I love you. At approximately 3 a.m., the PSW, the patient care worker, who's like a nurse's aide, found James' vital signs absent. I called the attending physician and James' family to inform them of James's death. The physician ruled his cause of death to be a post-surgery embolism. September, October at Carescent Care, Morris Grenat, not a diabetic. She goes on to describe this. Then Helen Matheson. And then in November of 2011, Mary Zerwinski, Gladys Millard. And this goes on for quite a few pages. And I encourage anybody who's interested to Google this and read Appendix A, which is her confession.
Appendix A. Okay. Okay. I just find it absolutely unbelievable that this woman confessed to all of this, and the names and the details, and wow. So
let me just fill in
Please.
a little bit about that.
please.
The reason she turned herself in is because she had been fired from at least 2, if not 3, long-term care employments. And she was now working for a registry. And a registry is where you will go and fill in where staff are needed on a shift-to-shift basis. You'll get a call from the people that are staffing agencies. You'll get a call, they'll say, this nursing home or this long-term care facility needs a nurse from this shift. And so are you willing to do that shift? And you say yes, and then you get paid through the staffing agency. So she had been working at a staffing agency doing elder care and long-term care. And they said, we have a need for staffing, a nurse staffing position to work with children, special needs children in schools, diabetic children. And she said, I was worried that I would get the urge to inject the children with insulin. And she kind of put it like, and I'm not a baby killer, or I'm not a child killer. So she somehow differentiated
Right.
the level of evilness
Right.
between what she was doing with the elderly. And she just felt she wasn't evil enough to do that to children, so she turned herself in.
Interesting. And I would think those justifications and minimizations are pretty common with people who have a cluster B personality disorder. I from what I understand, a lot of serial killers will say, yeah, but I didn't do X,
Yes.
or yes, I did this, but it wasn't so bad,
Wasn't so bad.
type
Yes.
of thing.
All
Okay.
perpetrators,
Right.
all perpetrators, whether it's domestic violence, a guy who beats his wife, okay? First, they will deny. Then, when they are confronted with evidence, they will minimize. Then they will justify it. They'll say, well, she provoked me. Or, you know, a sex abuser, a child molester will say, well, she came on to me. So they will justify it. And then they'll blame the victim. they'll say, well, you know, it was the patient's fault. He grabbed my breasts, or the patient was ready to die anyway. So those are what we see with all antisocial, psychopathic, sociopathic behaviors that hurt others. Denial, minimization, justification, and blaming the victim first.
Okay. You answered one of my questions already about how long this behavior that this lady was engaging in this behavior. Do we have any knowledge of the typical length of time that this is going on in their workplaces? Excellent.
Yeah. It ranges from our absolute best case. Now we're talking about a database of 152 doctors, nurses aides, and ancillary personnel like respiratory therapists or physical therapists or occupational therapists. Okay, 152 around the globe since 1970. Healthcare providers have been prosecuted. That means there's enough evidence to launch a process, to indict and to have a trial, a criminal trial of healthcare providers. That's a lot of people. And in our database, the best case scenario is a nurse in Georgia in 1986, where an intensive care unit in, this is Albany, Georgia, okay, it's a mid-sized city. They noticed that they were having a spike, meaning like 10 codes, cardiac arrests, in a 2 to 3 month period. They had 10 when they typically only had 2 codes in a 3 month period. And what was even more unusual about those codes is that the patients were resuscitated. So just for non-medical people to understand, when a patient codes, they are dead. And most of the time, CPR will not resuscitate them because they're dead. They're in the process of dying. CPR is to resuscitate people who've had a sudden heart stoppage, like through drowning or through choking or through, and in this case, through an overdose. But to revive a patient with CPR in a hospital is very, very unusual. You see it sometimes in television and stuff like that, where in the emergency room you can do it. But most of the time, the CPR is just a last ditch effort if somebody is not a no code. So the hospital was alarmed that there were so many cardiac arrests, and then they were very concerned because they were having such a good rescue rate. They were resuscitating these people who were having cardiac arrests in the ICU. So immediately, without alerting the nursing staff, they said, maybe it's a bad batch of medication. And they had drawn blood and done toxicology screens on the patients who had coded and the patients who had died. And they noticed an increased level of potassium chloride. Potassium chloride is an electrolyte. We drink it when we drink energy drinks, okay? It is often just a few milliliters are in a big IV bag when somebody is dehydrated to restore their electrolyte balance. So they said, maybe we've got super high concentrated potassium chloride. We're going to control it. We're going to make every single dose of potassium chloride has to be signed out by the nurse before they inject it into an IV bag or into a patient's running IV line. And all of a sudden, the number of codes went back down to maybe 2 and 3 months. So they said, aha, we have been able to catch this, but it wasn't bad potassium chloride. Anyway, that's when they had an epidemiologic analysis where they said, who has been on duty? And they also noticed that the codes all occurred on the evening shift, 3 to 11 shift. So then they started looking at who was present, who was the nurse who was the, staff who were there when the patients coded. And they found that Terry Rachels, who was the nurse on duty for every one of the patients that coded. So then when they were ready to go in and arrest her, it only took 3 more months once they had deterred the codes. So that was what I consider the most exemplary handling. The hospital didn't go to the press. They called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They arrested the right person, and they stopped it. Okay, some of the worst case scenarios go on for years. Charles Cullen may be the worst. And there's a movie out about him right now, The Good Nurse. I encourage everybody to watch it. I think it's on HBO or Netflix. But Charles Cullen is the poster child for how bad things can go when a hospital figures they've got a problem, that they're having too many codes, too many deaths. So they fire the nurse and they don't pass along information to the next hospital saying, we got a rogue, we think we have a rogue nurse here. They just let the nurse go work in another hospital. Then they start having suspicious deaths and they catch on. So that he was able to work, I think, for several years in 9 different hospitals and a nursing home over 2 states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and killed up to, they estimate, 200 plus patients. He only confessed to 40. But when they looked at the charts and they looked at how long the rise in suspicious codes and deaths went, they think it was about 200 that he killed. So, that's how bad it can be. And then Terry Rachels is the poster child for how quickly you should nip it in the bud and how to handle it in an appropriate prosecutorial way.
Excellent. And I guess it's fair to say then that if these people get away with it they're not going to slow down and stop. It's going to progress. Is that fair to say?
What we've learned from Elizabeth Wetlaufer is there may be a lot more out there of people who do this that don't get caught the way she did. What Elizabeth told us is that she did not go to work every day thinking, who am I going to kill today? Or can I get away with it today? It was the exact opposite. She went into work every day going, how can I resist the urge? She called it the red surge. How can I not do it at work today? And as long as she was in recovery, as long as she had her sponsor and was going to her AA meetings, as long as she was in a stable relationship, like she lived with a partner for a while who had children, and she'd go a few years and not have the red surge at all. And then when she fell off the wagon, one of the signs is that it would come back and she would have that urge to inject patients again. So, like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, like anorexia, and like substance abuse, these disorders can wax and wane depending on whether you're in recovery and what your stress level is and what your social supports are.
Okay. All right. Because even the way you talk about how her thought process sounds like an addict, an addiction.
Yes,
how can I not do this today? Right. Okay. And I'm just jumping a little bit because this is a topic now that actually ties into this. And I don't want to imply at all that everybody who's an introvert or works nights is somehow a predator. Not at all. However, is there any link whatsoever with these people liking to work nights? And if so, how do you factor in the covert? Is it covert video surveillance at that point? What can be done? Because if there's no knowledge of what these people are doing on the night shift.
Okay, so the first point is, yes, people who are psychopaths and happen to work in healthcare are attracted to working on the evening and night shift just because there's less eyes on you. Right. There's less, you have a lot more autonomy in long-term care, it's one nurse, and that nurse is in charge of a few unlicensed personnel usually. And it's one nurse, and you've got no supervisors around, no pharmacy, no doctors, no nothing, unless you call them.
Right.
So people who have a propensity to do this are attracted to working the evening and night shifts.
Okay.
And we see that in our data. The second question is, what about covert video surveillance?
Yes.
So, yes, a case in Texas, a recent case, and this is a male nurse, I think Mr. Davis. He just recently got convicted, and the way that he got away with it is that he could avoid the medication, because now we have all these safeguards in place with medication barcode tracking. Okay, now if a nurse gives a med, she scans the barcode on the patient's wristband. She scans the barcode on the single dose of medicine that is ordered for that patient. Okay, and it logs the time, the med, the patient, da, da, da. So this is a huge deterrent, right? To the average nurse murderer. So what Mr. Davis did is he injected air. Air is not a medicine. He would just get a big syringe, fill it up with air, go to the IV line, inject the IV line with like 10 cc's or more of air. That air would go into the bloodstream. When it hit the lungs and the heart, it would cause a cardiac arrest, or the brain, and it would cause a stroke. So they knew that they were having too many codes on the night shift. They suspected him. They put in video cameras for security, which is perfectly legal, put them in the hall, and they timed him going into the room, him coming out of the room, and 10 seconds later, the patient would have a stroke or code. And so that was very compelling circumstantial evidence, and it's perfectly legal to have video surveillance in hospitals.
Okay, and you don't need a warrant. Is that correct?
So if you're a private actor, and I've written about this for Munchausen by proxy, if the purpose of the covert surveillance is to try and get a diagnosis, if the child is admitted because they stop breathing, and you go, well, we'd like to just have continuous monitoring. If the child stops breathing, we want to see what happened right before that so we can figure out a cause and then treat it. And they go, oh, the cause of the apnea, the next apnea spell that is on videotape, is the mother is pinching the child's nose, reaching over the side rails and smothering the child. Then you go, oh, we now have a diagnosis. It's apnea by smothering. So as long as it's a private actor, if it's a doctor, if it's a nurse, if it's risk management, and they say for safety reasons, we need to have video surveillance, then that's probably very admissible in a criminal case. If it's the police, they need a warrant. And I encourage hospitals to work with police as soon as you can. Get started on this. Get a warrant. Cover all your bases. If you have too many, codes on an ICU, go ahead, get a warrant. It's probable cause.
Right.
And then put in your hidden cameras. And then there's also the option of overt video surveillance, which provides a deterrent.
Right.
When nurses or mothers know that there are all these cameras, they are much less likely to do criminal behavior that would because they know there'll be a record. And, we're finding this with robberies. We're finding this with home invasions. We're finding this everywhere, that cameras are ubiquitous. Everybody should just assume, if you're in a public place,
Agreed.
that there's going to be some video surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I talked about this before I started recording. I know this is a big subject, but like you mentioned, this just doesn't happen out of nowhere, and the public was demanding to know how this happened. So I want to just back up a little bit. Have there been histories of stalking behavior, harassing behavior, even false allegations against patients, managers, coworkers. From what I understand, a lot of these people, maybe not a lot, but some of these people are constantly going around accusing their coworkers of abuse, of things that is not accurate or things that are not abusive, to deflect off of what they're doing. So, or they're sexually harassing their colleagues. Is there oftentimes histories of this behavior?
Not enough to be able to quantify it,
Okay.
but in our anecdotal notes, meaning just what we read about the nurses' personalities or the respiratory therapist or whoever is the person being prosecuted for serial murder, there are lots of what we call histrionic relationship problems. Okay. Lots of splitting behaviors. He said, she said, you're either on my side or you're not. Lots of drama, lots of what we see with cluster B personalities that play out. We see lots of fabrication about all sorts of things. These people falsify their credentials, they falsify their personal histories, they love the code, they're histrionic, and so that all fits. What we have seen, though, which is tragic, is that when some of the nurses who report their concerns to their supervisors are told to be quiet, are told that they can't talk about it. One nurse in Indiana, when Orville Lynn Majors, all the nurses said, he's the angel of death. If I turn my patients over to him to go down to the cafeteria for lunch, I come back and my patient is coding or crashing. They knew they had a problem. And the nurse went to the hospital administrators and she said, I'm going to have to report this to the Board of Nursing because too many adverse patient incidents are happening when this nurse is on duty with patients he's caring for. And the hospital administrator said, if you do that, you will be jumping the chain of command and you will be fired. She went and she reported it and she was fired. And she said she's left nursing. She said that she was so harassed and made so miserable. The hospital said, you better not go to the press. You absolutely have to keep this quiet. Do not let the other nurses talk about it. And
absolutely.
And she just said, my faith in humanity and in working in healthcare has been destroyed. I'm not going to be a nurse anymore. Also, once the law enforcement got involved, they discovered that the hospital was supposed to have monthly death review meetings where an interdisciplinary committee would meet every month and review all the deaths for that month and go, are there any red flags? Are there any suspicious deaths? They had not been meeting 10 out of the 11 months that Orville Lynn Majors was killing patients. So the hospital administration knew they were going to look bad. And rather than stop Orville from killing patients, they stopped the head nurse from reporting it.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I have heard of people, as many as 6 people who didn't even know each other, reporting somebody with serious red flags and all getting fired, harassed, mobbed, forced to resign, humiliated, you name it. And so thank you for saying that, because that's very real. It really does happen a lot. It drives good people out of the healthcare field. And I guess my final thing in that, B, is what is in it for the employers to protect them? Like, is there any incentive?
Yes.
Okay, can we talk about that, please? Please.
Yes. Okay. First of all, so criminal arrests can be public record. Okay. So if you arrest somebody just, you got probable cause, you arrest them. And the word gets out, the local newspaper finds out that this nurse got arrested. And why, they read the arrest warrant and it gets in the newspaper. The hospital has such a PR crisis. It's just, but of course the PR crisis gets 20 times worse if it is indeed a crime. So they walk that line, but right off the bat, they want to avoid being sued for giving a bad reference. Okay, let's say they fired the nurse. And what I have said to hospital risk managers is, okay, if you give somebody a bad reference and they sue you, if you lied about it, they can go for libel or slander. And maybe they'll get $40,000 to $100,000 in damages if you've been bad about it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you just go, all I can do is verify that they worked here on these dates. That's all I can tell you. I can't tell you if they were a good or bad nurse, And then it turns out the criminal investigation finds them guilty of killing a bunch of patients in your hospital, or even one or two with other suspicious deaths. You're looking at bankrupting your liability insurance for wrongful death. So just think about it, $40,000 for bad reference versus a gazillion dollars for having allowed this.
I agree. Plus, in some cases, sexual harassment, discrimination, lawsuits. That's what I didn't understand. What's in it for them in the long haul to protect these people? Like it's amazing.
What's in it is reputation.
Okay.
It's reputation.
Right. Okay. Thank you, B. Thank you so much. I'm just honored and thrilled that we could speak about this today, that we can bring this information to the public. What are you up to in the coming, what's going on for you going into 2023? What are you up to these days? I'm sure a ton.
So I'm continuing to work with the team that published our 2006 article. I'm continuing to refine the report that I wrote for the Canadian government for the long-term care inquiry, and looking forward to publishing more on that, and running, as you mentioned, support groups for both adult survivors of Munchausen by proxy, for non-offending parents, typically fathers, of kids that they've tried to protect from a mother who is doing Munchausen by proxy, and hopefully presenting what we're finding from running these groups. We're finding the lived experience of what it's like to have survived this type of abuse.
That's fantastic. And I know the one website, I will link it, but it's Munchausen-support.com. Okay.
It's just Munchausen Support.
Okay.
Munchausen Support, all one word, .com.
Munchausensupport.com. Perfect.
And we are available to people who think they might be a victim. We're available to people who think their partner, spouse, or somebody they know. If a kid they know, we have lots of resources.
That's fantastic. And what is the other site, or is it all Munchausensupport.com?
It's all Munchausen.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
.com.
Okay, and B, if is that the best place for people to find out what you're doing, to reach out to you, to look, to read your articles?
You can Google me.
Okay.
And I'm available at calstatela.edu.
Okay.
And if you just Google my name, you can probably find my email address.
Perfect. And I'll chat for a minute with you after the recording, but B, thank you so much for doing this with me today. It was amazing. It was so great. Thank you.
My pleasure.